Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Isla Barker. So on the programme this week we are delighted to be joined by William Duguid. Good afternoon, William.
Good afternoon, hope you're well.
And I hope you're well too. And we are also delighted to welcome back Hugh Marshall from Talking Wales. Good afternoon, Hugh.
Good afternoon, Prynhawn da.
So to start, we will begin with the Starmer-Mandelson situation. The who, when, what, when Mandelson affair continues to create chaos in the UK government, as it was revealed that Peter Mandelson was appointed to be a US ambassador despite failing developed vetting. Sir Keir Starmer denies knowledge of this, raising questions as to whether he is lying or incompetent. What will be revealed in the House of Commons this week as Starmer and Ollie Robbins appear? So I think it is best to start with the biggest question. We'll start with Hugh here. Do you think the Prime Minister should resign because of this whole affair?
I think it's going to be very difficult for him to hold his position this time. Somebody made a point in an interview that he keeps sort of sacking people who have supposedly not advised him properly, but he's the one who's driving the car. So it makes you wonder, how many mechanics can you sack before you've actually got to decide, well, actually it's the driver's fault. So whether it's, whether he's lied, we don't know, and we won't know that until next week. He's going to make he's going to go in front of the House tomorrow, but I think Tuesday will be the most interesting day when the civil servant in question is speaking in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'd imagine that's going to be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and William, what do you think about the Prime Minister's position and whether he could keep it or not?
Well, I think it's very difficult for a politician to keep his position in the circumstances. He's either, as you say, lying about what he knew and when he knew it, or he's not able to deal with the system as it stands, and is not asked the right questions at the right times. It's absolutely fundamental to be knowing at least for sure whether somebody passed vetting. And if he didn't do that, that is a sign of incompetence. And generally speaking, you'll notice as the week goes on how much support he's still got amongst his colleagues. It's quite unlikely, I think, that the Labour will want him to go before the Scottish elections and the Welsh elections have happened, because that could be difficult, perhaps, for Labour, or it might, in fact, help Labour in these respective countries. Who knows? But you don't want that sort of disruption coming up to an election. So I don't think anything will happen in the short term, but you will know from the way the comments of his colleagues are going, how it's going after the two big events happening. First, Starmer himself talking to the House of Commons tomorrow, and then Ollie Robbins talking to the Foreign Affairs Committee on Tuesday.
Of course, and so obviously one of the most important parts of this whole debacle is that it's gone undetected for so long. So how do you think it has taken this long to reveal that not only did he fail vetting, but also the Prime Minister supposedly was not told about it?
I think
I'll
from...
take that one on this. Oh, no, I won't.
Oh, sorry.
Who do you want to start?
No, you go, Brian. You go, William, sorry.
All right. I don't know how long it has gone undetected and how long it's actually been kept a secret. That's one of the things we're going to find out. But I think it was a journalist who began leaking it that brought it out into the open. And some of if you go back through Keir Starmer's statements, they've been sort of insisting on things that have happened, which indicated that he had some insider knowledge in any case, as he should have done. So I think maybe there has part of the reason that this would be really difficult for him is that I suspect this has been covered up. And how it could have happened is another matter. I do think there was probably a fair bit of pressure on the vetters to accept Peter Mandelson because he was the Prime Minister's choice and the guy who would be able to deal with Donald Trump, and that's the important thing. And maybe that sort of pressure was being put on without actually getting to the point where you say, Um, don't tell me if he doesn't get through. I don't want to know about the vetting. Just make sure it works. That would be the sort of approach, perhaps. Now, that's speculation, but that's one of the things we have to find out going forward.
And Hugh, what do you think about how this has gone undetected for as long as it has?
Well, Mandelson should never even have been considered for the post in the first place. They had a perfectly good and experienced ambassador who was, liked by the Trump administration, had good contacts there. I think it goes back to the fact that, it appears that Mandelson was seemingly being rewarded for his work using his contacts to purge the Labour Party of the left, when they sort of undermined Corbyn and all that, and it was some sort of payback that he would get this reward for doing his dark arts. But remember Mandelson is a guy who had to resign twice from cabinet because of past misdemeanors, and he's known as being not a very pleasant individual. And obviously, the fact that he's was big mates with Epstein and continued that relationship afterwards just shows the man for who he is. He should never have been considered in the first place. And I think that's the thing for Starmer. It doesn't matter, that he's angry that he wasn't told one thing or the other. Everybody knew what Mandelson was and what he was like. So why he actually considered him for that position in the first place, it looks again, that Starmer is basically was being run by your McSweeney's and the other sort of apparatchiks that were around him. I think it shows basically that Keir Starmer, he might be a nice enough guy, but he's just a useless Prime Minister.
So then, Hugh, do you think there's a possibility of a vote of no confidence, or is it too early to say?
I think the problem Labour have is who they got to replace him, because the issue isn't Starmer, it's it's this blue Labour who seem to be controlling sort of Labour at the moment. We saw at the last general election with parachuting in people who would be happy to do Starmer's bidding for him. So they're in a very difficult position. And as William was saying, with the run up to the Senedd and the Holyrood, and also obviously the local council elections in England, it's a disaster in waiting. If he goes before then, it's really bad for them. If he doesn't go, it's still bad for them, because Starmer, on the doorstep, is just toxic.
Thank you very much. Now moving on to our Middle East update. 773 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the start of the October 2025 ceasefire, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023 to 72,549. As Trump announces a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the Strait of Hormuz was open is now closed again. So we'll start with William. How do you think this is going to impact the United States' future role in diplomacy and international conflict resolution? For example, with the United Nations, the United States has already pulled out of the World Health Organization. There were previous threats of pulling out of NATO. What do you think America's role could be in the future on the world stage?
That's a very interesting question, because I think Trump has absolutely ruined the reputation of the USA in international circles for many years to come. Even if he is got out of power and somebody that they can trust comes into power, an administration that actually is functioning and not crazy off the scale, there's always the possibility that the US will elect another lunatic at some point. You just, at the moment, can't trust them as far as you can throw them. And that really is quite a difficulty for America's position in the world going forward. And it is a shame, because actually, I think the net effect of America's influence in the world has often been very good in the last 60 years. But we lose that. And of course, right now we lose all the rubbish as well, perhaps. But it's very difficult to see where they go from here. And it's going to be a lot of fence mending and bridge building, and perhaps just a change within the country driven by the people, if that's even possible at this stage. So I wouldn't want to be joining the Foreign Service if I were an American doing well in college at the moment. Let's put it that way.
And so, Hugh, what do you think the US could do to either improve its image, or if that is even possible, how will the world stage look with the US the way it is?
I think William touched on a really important point. Obviously, it's important that that we have relationship with United States, but that doesn't mean that Trump is the United States. We have to look beyond that. But there's no guarantee that that this could happen again in the future. That we get a complete madman surrounded by idiots and lunatics in the White House. So I think to a certain extent, I think it's been a good thing, because it's forcing the rest of the world now to realise you can't trust the United States in the future. We have to think about alliances across Europe, and again it just makes the point of Brexit, how much of a disaster that's been from a financial point of view, but also from a sort of a political point of view. And we see, I mentioned Mandelson and Epstein. We know that Farage is mentioned in the Epstein files on numerous points, not to do anything with sort of the sex trafficking, but to do with destabilizing Western democracies. It was very heartening to see Orban lose in Hungary last week. But he was replaced by somebody who is pro-European, but was still, is on the right of Hungarian politics. So it does show that they can be defeated. But we live in uncertain times. But we know that there is this cabal of people, the Trumps, the Orbans, Putin, who are trying to destabilise Western democracy, and that is the biggest concern. The United Nations, I've mentioned this countless times on Broadcast Scotland. When I was growing up, United Nations actually had power, and people listen to them. That's the thing now; people just don't listen anymore. The fact that you've got, we're discussing now, the situation in Palestine, and it's worth remembering that 2 aid workers transporting water were killed by the IDF this week. So even though we're talking about peace in the Middle East and a ceasefire, it's just not happening. People are still being killed in people are being murdered in Palestine, and it's a terrible state. We had this farcical situation of this Trump peace board, where people had to pay membership, and it had people like Orban and basically all the worst people in the world, and Tony Blair involved in it. And it just shows it's the credibility of these people. It's time people just stood up and just said to Trump, "No, we're not joining your clubs. We're not taking part in your extortion rackets. Enough is enough, and we're just going to crack on as we are." Because who's going to suffer in the long term is the United States. Their economy is going to suffer. Yes, it's an important economy, but they are reliant as well on the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world stands up to them, they're going to be in serious trouble. And I think that's the thing that's going to harm Trump at the end, is the financial aspect. The fact that he's driven up fuel prices in the United States because of what's happening in Iran. And the final thing was just laughable, the ceasefire between Israel and the Lebanon. Sort of Trump is claiming now that he's ended another war, one that he actually started. It's just off the scale, his craziness.
And so with the midterm elections coming up and Trump receiving accusations of trying to pull the War Act to delay or even stop them, do you think that the midterms could go on at their scheduled time, William?
Well, I very much hope they do, because I don't think there's sufficient reason to stop them, just in terms of the emergency that the government has just created that's going on. I do think there is going to be a big problem in getting through the midterms with a sort of result that might change things, because as well as the possibility of the elections actually being cancelled for some spurious reason, there is obvious suppression of voting that's going on with various measures that are taking place, and the idea that ICE might be in attendance at the polling stations or around the polling stations, indeed they call them polling stations in America, um, it's not a healthy situation. But at the same time, there is a groundswell now of opposition, and it's growing and growing and growing. And the No Kings protest was just the latest a couple of weeks ago, that showed the strength of it. It's not yet quite at the magic 3.5% of the people that need to be out that's always cited as being required to change things, but it is getting there. And I think there are some Democrat politicians now who really are growing a spine and standing out, and I expect to hear more from them. And I also expect at some stage, um, it's going to be a question as to whether Trump is still useful to his puppet masters, or if they need somebody else who isn't clearly off his rocker. And maybe some of the opposition to Trump will come from his own folks. Now, that doesn't necessarily help the overall situation in terms of rescuing America from the slough of despond into which it's fallen. But it changes things around a little bit and maybe provides the opportunity for greater change. We shall just have to see, but it's very unpredictable.
And so, Hugh, do you think the midterm elections could happen at least on time?
Yeah, I think they will. I think what you're finding now as well is, as Trump is now becoming clearly more and more deranged. Because I think that the issue Trump had was he could lie to the US people, and there were enough of them who would believe his lies for him to gain power. The trouble is, once you start going onto the global stage and claiming that this war will be over in a day, it'll be over in a week, we're having great conversations, Iran are going to give us their radioactive materials, and lying on that level on the global stage, because he's been shown up now that he's just lying. He just makes stuff up. So I think that is damaging him. His base, the MAGA base, they're still going to be there, but I think they are diminishing in certain numbers. But what's interesting as well is the pushback. When things are happening in the States now, the courts tend to be fighting against him. So I don't think there's that much of that appetite. I think the more mad he becomes, the more sort of the courts and sensible people, because even Republicans are voting against sort of stuff that's going through Congress and the Senate now. And when you see any sort of, because I follow US politics quite closely, looking at results of, sort of standalone elections, the Democrats are either overturning, results, where they'd lost to Republicans, or where Republicans were, sort of 90%, of the vote, that they're getting that gap down hugely. So, I think, he's obviously trying to get as much madness done before the midterms, because, it's clear that, regardless of whatever shenanigans he tries to pull, he's going to lose the Senate and the other house as well. So, yeah, I'm quite confident that they will go ahead, because if they don't, William was talking about the 3.5%. I can imagine you're going to be getting 5, 6, 7% out on the streets protesting.
Okay, thank you very much. And now moving on to the UK economy. This week, the IMF released its forecast for UK economic growth, and it warned that the UK does not have the fiscal space to address energy price hikes. The UK is also facing risks of food shortages due to the US and Israeli war on Iran, holding all imports of CO2 and fertilizer. So, William, how bad do you think these food shortages could get in a worst-case scenario?
Well, the UK currently imports, I think, 43% or thereabouts of its food needs. So if transportation of food is curtailed, and also if the lack of fertilizer as a result of the Strait of Hormuz being closed has a big impact, then I think there's a fair chance that there'll be food shortages, maybe not directly, but caused by perhaps panic buying or something like that, something that will have to be addressed in some way. There's potentially two ways in which it could be addressed. One is rationing by price, which would be appalling for the people that can't afford it. The other one is simple rationing by allocation. And I can see that as a possibility. And there are other commentators, such as Richard Murphy, who seem to be thinking that will happen. There'll be a much wider problem worldwide with the fertilizer, I should imagine. And there are some countries where famine is a strong possibility if there's a prolonged lack of fertilizer or any other shock like that. And that's really the bigger concern, because I think it's going to be tough in the UK, but we'll get through it. But I'm not so sure about some other places.
And Hugh, how bad do you think these food shortages could get, or what they could look like?
Yeah, and I think it's not a case of shortages of food per se, because obviously, we do import, lots of chicken and pork, but we do, we're quite sort of good at sort of farming chickens. But it's the issue of things like CO2 that's used in the slaughter of animals, and also, the packaging for meat. So, it looks like it could be the other things that are actually going to be the cause of the shortages, not necessarily the shortage of the actual raw products themselves, but how those are created, how they're packed, and how they're distributed. Because that's the other thing, is obviously distribution costs are going up through the roof because the cost of diesel. Most lorries are diesel, so you can imagine what the costs involved there are now. But I think there are going to be shortages. There's going to be food inflation is going to go up, and I think as we realise, sort of prices go up, but they never go back down. I was talking to a cafe owner yesterday, and she was talking about the costs of their raw ingredients and everything keep going up. But even if there is inflation is slowing down, the prices never go back down. So yeah, I think it's a really bad situation, and I think it's worth remembering. This is all because of Donald Trump, an invasion of Iran with no sort of real basis, no exit plan. Just something. It does look like a distraction from other things. Whether that's the case or not, we'll probably never know. But this is going to be harming the people who enabled him, and people like Nigel Farage, who called him the bravest man that he had ever met.
Wow. So obviously, all of Europe and all of the world is in the same figurative boat with the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran as well. So then, how come the UK has been less economically resilient? We'll start with William.
I think UK is kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of importing food. So there are some places such as Germany, for example, that makes a lot more of their own food. They'll still have the other issues around transportation, etc. But I think it's probably the fact that already costs are quite high in some areas in the UK, such as energy costs, with them set to go further. And therefore, it's the resilience of individuals to cope with that, and the inevitable thing that they will cut back their spending, which will in itself harm growth. So that's why the IMF has said that of the G7 countries, the shrinkage in growth, and I suspect it actually may turn into recession, but at the moment they're looking at 0.8% down from 1.3% for growth for the year. I think that's why they've come up with that particular figure. I think all countries will have a problem, but I think some other countries have got a built-in resilience because they're better producers of things, because things aren't already as expensive there, such as energy, and probably also just the general resilience of the population to that kind of financial shock is stronger in some countries that have got a stronger welfare system. So the UK is probably simply failing on all counts, and something will need to be done about it. That's a kind of garbled explanation of it all. I'll now hand over to Hugh for the real story.
So then, Hugh, what is your input on the UK's economic resilience, or a lack of it, we could say?
I think there's the fact that we're an island, so it does mean, sort of getting food in, and Brexit, because obviously it's easier to transport food and goods across borders within the European Union. So you can take stuff in to ports in Italy and France, and then transport them by road across Europe. Because the other thing, obviously, when you go into your local supermarket and you're looking to buy some some avocados from Peru, those will have been flown into the UK as well. So we're very reliant on flying food in, and as we've seen from the reports, the cost of jet fuel is skyrocketing, pardon the pun. So yeah, I think Brexit is a huge issue, because obviously there's issues with getting sort of food and goods into the UK compared with the rest of the EU. As William was saying, energy costs. We've got the highest energy costs. Sort of most sort of European countries. And it's not just down to sort of gas and oil. It's far more complicated than that. But it does make you wonder why you've got Wales and Scotland who create an abundance of energy. We create more energy than we consume, Wales and Scotland, in order to provide energy for England. We have the highest energy bills within the UK.
Thank you. So then, with the elections coming up, are there any manifesto proposals that could potentially alleviate these rising costs or these issues with distribution, Hugh?
It's very hard. I think especially from a devolved government point of view, in Wales particularly, because the devolved competencies are basically around transport, education, and health. The taxation powers that Wales have are limited, and compared with Scotland, we have no sort of input on social security and benefits. So anything that that could be done, it has to, from a Wales perspective, it has to be done at the UK level, and we know how sort of bad things are within the Labour government at the moment, and that's a sad thing as well. Is Mandelson's distracting the Labour Party and the Labour government from doing their day job, which is to sort of make sure that people's lives are better. And I think sadly, people are frustrated, but their food shops are going up. If you've got a diesel car, compared with 3 months ago, it's now costing you £20 more every time you go and fill up your car. So people are feeling it in their pockets, and that frustration leads people to vote for parties like Reform. But again, that's why Scotland and Wales needs independence. Until we've got the full fiscal levers around borrowing and being able to sort of take our own decisions, we're reliant on a Westminster government that we haven't voted for.
Of course. And then, William, how do you think, are there any proposals in the manifestos that could help? Or, for example, Ireland has proposed a €750 million package for financial support during this time. So what do you think the UK could learn from other countries with this inflation crisis?
Well, the UK could support people better, that's for sure. Now, the IMF is saying that there's limited fiscal space to do that, although there's not no fiscal space. The IMF is talking about targeted support and maybe temporary support, but that would be better than nothing. Another way to do it, of course, in the medium term, would be to review the way the energy market actually works in the UK to remove the original cause of prices being so high in the first place. So there may be options beyond that, for example, there was a great amount of support during COVID that because it was effectively a supply shock issue, there wasn't an inflationary push as a result. The one thing the IMF is really worried about is debt and, to a lesser extent, inflation. And there are other ways of looking at the world, other framings of it that might enable the UK to do more. Proponents, for example, of modern monetary theory would say that you could do a lot more in terms of supporting people, and that's the way you support the economy, and that debt isn't quite as important as that because the UK can't run out of money. On the other side, the Bank of England says, well, the country's fiscal reputation does matter and markets matter. And probably the truth lies in between the two. But there is space, I think, for policy, particularly in support for energy costs, that the UK could be thinking a lot more about. Although I see no sign at the moment that they're actually doing so.
So then, thank you, William. So then, Hugh, should Wales become independent in the near future, do you think it would have to join the EU for extra financial or economic backing, or would an independent Wales be able to stand on its own, or do you think it should join the EU?
Personally, I think we should be joining the EU, and I think what's happening in the United States shows that there is a need for countries to work together collaboratively. We had all the scare stories about the European army, and that's why we needed our sovereignty. Well, look at the state of the UK armed forces now. Everybody from sort of former generals to politicians now saying that it's not fit for purpose. We had to, when we sent ships to the Middle East, we had to borrow ships from, I think it was Germany and another country. So it shows that the purpose of having a European Union, an economic union, because it does give you the clout and the power. And remember, the Brexit was driven by those people, by Farage, Putin, Orban, Trump, all that sort of that cabal, in order to, because obviously losing the United Kingdom from the European Union weakened the European Union economically, as well as harming us. But the whole point was to harm the European Union by removing us from it, not to benefit the UK, because obviously there was no benefit to it. So yeah, definitely, so I think Wales and Scotland within the EU and having a voice would make a huge difference to people in Wales and Scotland. Look at Ireland. Ireland are able to do things because they're part of the European Union.
Thank you, Hugh. And then, William, do you think an independent Scotland should join the EU, or do you think it could stand on its own if it either could not or decides not to join the EU in that situation?
Well, I'm sure it could survive it in any case because it has resources. I think, personally, I think it should join the EU because that gets us back to the position that was working for us in the past. Not everybody in the independence movement even agrees with that, but I think a majority do. And a majority of the people, I think, if it were put to them in a referendum, would want to go back into the EU. So I think that's the way we should go. There are other options, such as EFTA, which would, I think, not be as effective, but would be more effective than what we've got now. I do think that an independent Scotland will need to be expanding itself and its markets and its friends and its allegiances as much as possible. And the EU is a very, very important part of that. But if it comes to it in the short term, I think we have the resources to survive and the ingenuity to survive. But we need to do a wee bit more than just survive. We need to repair the economy, and we need to then become the prosperous country and the good friend to others as well that we have the potential to be as an independent country.
Thank you, William. And now moving on to our Ukraine update. Authorities in Ukraine are investigating the possible motives behind Saturday's mass shooting and hostage-taking in which a gunman killed 6 people in Kyiv. The SBU security service called it a terrorist act after the shooting on Saturday evening. President Volodymyr Zelensky said all available information about and the motives behind his actions is being thoroughly investigated. The gunman opened fire on passers-by before barricading himself in a supermarket and taking hostages. Detectives sealed off the area and tried to negotiate with him. The gunman was killed after a 40-minute standoff. Also, a strike in northern Ukraine killed a teenage boy and wounded 4 people, the city military administration said on Sunday. 4 people have been wounded in the attack, which damaged several houses and administrative and educational buildings. The Kremlin is grappling with the fallout from the viral spread of celebrity bloggers' criticism of Russian authorities as Vladimir Putin's approval ratings register their 6th consecutive weekly decline. Victoria Bonya, a household name in Russia who rose to fame in 2006 on Dom 2, the country's answer to the reality TV show Big Brother, posted a video on Monday warning the Russian president that a string of mounting problems risked spiraling out of control. People are afraid of you. Artists are afraid and governors are afraid, she said in the 18-minute video on Instagram, which has garnered 26 million views and more than 1.3 million likes in the past 4 days. The influencer's comments notably stopped short of directly targeting Putin himself or the war in Ukraine, prompting speculation that the intervention may have been coordinated with Moscow to signal that public grievances are being heard before parliamentary elections later this year. So we'll start with William. What are your predictions for the next few months of this conflict, especially with this potential decline in approval for Putin and some resistance against him in the public eye?
I think things will carry on much as they are, because I don't think there's any great focus in the world on ending the war in Ukraine. I think Putin has some problems at home, but I also think that some of what's happening in the Middle East will work to his benefit in terms of certainly Trump is lifting some of his ability to move funds about, and the EU may be forced into a similar position if it's the only way, for example, to get oil is to get it from Russia, then they will have to do it. So it's very much up in the balance. I don't think Russia has got the impetus to make any great inroads anymore into Ukraine right now. But at the same time, I don't think Russia is just going to melt away, and I don't think anything internal is going to prevent Russia from continuing the pressure on Ukraine. So I just see a stalemate, which actually needs a real intervention by somebody who really knows what they're talking about, and trying to sort this out after, what is it now? Is it 2 years? No, it's more than 2 years. It's 3 years, 4 years. It's just dragging on now, and it's not working to anybody's benefit.
Thank you. And Hugh, do you have any predictions for the foreseeable future of the Ukraine war?
I think, the fact that Ukraine are holding their own, the fact that Orban has gone, which will hopefully release funds and allow them to re-equip themselves with arms. Obviously, one of the big beneficiaries of the Iran war at the moment is Russia, because the oil that they're still selling, even though they shouldn't be allowed to sell anything, or anybody should be buying anything from them, is generating sort of big revenues for them at the moment. But yeah, again, it's Putin. He's a dictator who has got absolute control over the populace. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's difficult to see what will happen until Putin goes. But there's obviously sort of people in Russia can't be happy with what's going on, and time will tell. But that's the other thing is whilst Trump is there, then Putin of relative power.
Thank you very much. And now moving on to Hungary. After the landslide victory for Peter Magyar in Hungary, what lessons should Scotland and Wales learn about defeating the far right? So we'll start with William. So a lot of Reform voters have chosen Reform in recent elections, whether that's local or by-elections, because they are disillusioned with the two-party system and they believe that Reform is the way out of that. How can the SNP show voters in the upcoming Holyrood elections that Reform is not the way?
Well, I think really it's by talking to the people that are thinking in terms of voting to Reform, and pointing out to them that there are other alternatives that will work better. But also, you need to address those people's concerns. And, if they're talking about immigration, let's talk about immigration. And let's talk about why immigration can be beneficial, and how any independent country, for example, would want to run its own immigration system to the benefit of that country, while leaving a space for legitimate asylum seekers as well, and trying to take the heat out of some of the reporting that is influencing the people that are thinking in terms of people voting for Reform. The lesson from Hungary is that Peter Magyar, instead of just saying the other side is wrong, the other side is wrong, went out and talked throughout Hungary to people who had been supporters of Orban and talked through their issues with them and addressed how things might be done better. And I think the Yes movement generally, as well as the SNP, doesn't really talk enough to the unionists about their concerns and what might be fixed there and what might be done better and why Scotland will be better independently. So I've got a wee bit beyond SNP versus reform, but the main principle is there, that Peter Magyar actually went out and spoke to people supporting the other side and brought them on board with his thinking. And that's what we need to do a lot more.
Thank you. And Hugh, how do you think Plaid Cymru could appeal to potential reform voters or people who are already planning to vote for reform in the upcoming election?
Yeah, I think, when you think of people who vote reform, I was talking to a Plaid Cymru candidate who was knocking doors and came across a reform supporter and said, oh, they were voting reform. And, she asked the question, which of their policies do you like? And the response came, rather disturbingly, that they're racist ones. So, there is an element of, of the hardcore of people who are, just generally horrible people who, believe that immigration and sort of basically race is behind all of our woes. But those people are angry about everything. But as William was saying, I think we do need to sort of discuss things. I think the big thing for me is because, when you hear Labour politicians and Shabnam Mahmood say, people have got, genuine concerns about immigration, then, we need to have a conversation about, why we need immigration. Look at Spain; their economy is growing because they realise the importance of immigrants in order to help grow their economy. One of the reasons why the UK economy isn't growing is because of the policy around migration. So they've turned something, that into a bogeyman without discussing the positive impacts and why immigration is needed. But the focus is on small boats. This belief that the UK has been flooded by young Muslim men of fighting age that are coming here to sort of start some sort of holy war. It's just abhorrent nonsense. The percentages are tiny, but like I say, it doesn't help when we have a media, like the BBC this week ran a series of exclusive stories around immigrants and how they can get around, different things. Where the reality is the number of people they were actually discussing, who probably are sort of bending the rules, wherever, are minuscule. But they're fueling this idea that immigration is a problem, as opposed to it being something sort of sensible that is needed from an economic perspective.
Yes, so the use of episodic framing rather than thematic framing, I see. So then, moving on to the aforementioned elections. With only 2.5 weeks until the elections in Scotland and Wales coming up, how are the campaigns looking at the moment? So, William, how do you think the SNP is looking at the moment? Obviously, we still have 2.5 weeks to go before we go to the polls, and polls are not always online polls are not always indicative of what the results will actually be. But how do you think the SNP could turn out on this day?
The polls are actually fairly favourable for the SNP, as you're saying. Although their percentage support is way down on where it was in 2021 and 2016. I do know from experience of people at the Perth Hub who are SNP members who are supporting their campaign. We're a non-party hub, but we have people from SNP and all other places too. That they are working very, very hard to get boots on the ground, and because that's the big advantage they have, to be able to campaign in numbers, to canvass, to leaflet, etc. And what's coming back from that is a set of mixed messages at the minute. There are some positive signs that the opposition to the SNP seems to be freeing in all sorts of areas at the minute. Labour is clearly nosediving after this little contretemps with reform at the debate the other week, where there was this indication that Labour may have been open at one stage to some sort of coalition with Reform. That will not go down particularly well. The Tories are in free fall. So it's everything to play for the SNP. And also, I would say, for the Scottish Greens, because the Scottish Greens have got perhaps a bit of a bounce from the Zach Polanski effect, even though the English Greens are a completely separate organisation. I think there are signs with the new youthful leadership of the Scottish Greens that they could make a bit of an impact, particularly on the list. So it's everything to play for, but the big bugbear is turnout. And a low turnout, and it looks as if it will be lower than it was in 2026 by some distance, that could influence matters in all sorts of unpredictable ways and might bring you some unpredictable results. So a lot of work still to be done.
I see. And so you mentioned a decline in support from 2021. What do you think is the reason behind that?
I think it's because they didn't make much progress on independence. There was a lot of talk around 2021 about where things might go with regard to independence. And as we came out of COVID, let's get the engine starting to run. And of course, there was an attempt to hold a referendum, and that didn't come to anything. And then it seemed to be put on the back burner. And they suffered for that in the UK parliamentary elections in 2024. And I think their percentage has not recovered very much. And they're suffering again. And there are a few people in the independence movement that don't know where to place their vote now because they can't find anywhere to go that suits their feelings on independence and also everything else.
So thank you very much. Now, Hugh...
Did my last statement come through there, or did I thought I may have said something that didn't come through properly.
You did freeze for just a second there.
Aye, that was why.
So thank you very much. And Hugh, with Plaid Cymru, how are they looking in the polls at the moment?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a new poll coming out on Tuesday from YouGov, which tend to be the most sort of sensible and sort of trusted polling, which does show that Plaid are in the lead ahead of Reform. As it's a similar situation here in Wales. Labour supporters have gone off a cliff. So I think the fact that Labour have been in government in Wales for 25 years, the fact that we've got a Labour government that's unpopular at Westminster, is really sort of harming them. So they're going to go down. Conservatives, they're not doing anything here. The Greens will do well in maybe in sort of some of the more sort of metropolitan areas like Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport. But yeah, it's basically been seen as a two-horse race here between Plaid Cymru and Reform. So I don't think Plaid are taking anything for granted, but it does look positive. And as differently to Scotland, I think we're going to have a higher turnout, and I think one of the reasons for that is people are genuinely scared and dislike Reform. So if that's the case and there is a high turnout, that will benefit Plaid Cymru, especially if more young people vote as well. So we'll see how it goes. There's only a couple of weeks. I think it's 17 days, something like that, to go now. And we'll know on Friday the 8th at 4:30 what the results are.
And so with Plaid Cymru, are there plans announced either in their manifesto or in general of an independence referendum within Wales, or do they have the authority to do that?
No, the independence hasn't been discussed in this campaign, because obviously this is potentially the first time Plaid Cymru could form a government in Wales, because obviously Labour have been the ruling party since devolution came in 1999. I think what Plaid Cymru are saying for this election of the next 4 years is the priority is to try and fix things that Labour have failed to do. So I think Plaid Cymru are sensibly saying, well, we need to focus on the day job and trying to sort things out and making things better for people in Wales. So obviously independence is the long-term goal, but I think Plaid Cymru would prefer to sort of earn their get that positive response, and hopefully, if they win this time, get support the next time, and then, I think we can start discussing independence. But we're behind the curve compared to Scotland when it comes to discussing independence. But again, it's a youth thing. You look at the polling; people over 60 are hugely opposed to independence. People under 25 are hugely in favour of independence.
Thank you very much. Now, William, we'll start with you. So, with reform gaining some popularity in certain areas, and then the SNP also gaining some traction, what are the differences between SNP and reform economic policies? Because the cost of living crisis is what voters are most concerned about at the moment. So how does the SNP differ from Reform UK in that aspect?
Quite a large way. The SNP offering, in fact, in terms of the cost of living, is to support people by introducing a price cap on essentials at supermarkets, perhaps 20 to 50 essentials. Now, interestingly, they're using public health powers to do that, because that's something over which they have control rather than having control of the economy, which is one of the things we keep returning to. Also, they've got expanded affordable housing ambitions. They've got subsidised childcare in there. They've got cutting the cost of public transport by introducing a £2 cap on single bus fares. So that sort of thing about supporting people. The issue is, how will it be afforded? Where will the money come from? Because Scotland works with a limited budget, and that's where people are arguing back against the SNP on that. But the aspiration is there. Reform is more about cutting taxes back, cutting regulation, and hoping that growth will come from basically giving rich people more money and expecting them to plough that into the economy in whatever way. And I think that has been something that's tried and failed in the past, and isn't actually all that popular in Scotland, and I don't think is the thing that's driving reform support. What's driving reform support is probably the immigration issues, but there is the other side to it, which is their economic approach, which I don't think is that popular.
And so, how do you think the SNP could afford all these policies? Would there be tax increases or spending cuts in public funding, or something else?
I think there will have to be some tax increases on those who can afford it. That would be what I would do if I were in their position. I think there would have to be perhaps some efficiencies, and I mean genuine efficiencies, in some of the public services. I think NHS Scotland has a good track record of introducing efficiencies which may not exist in other parts of the UK's health service, because they've had to, because money has been limited. But it's a difficult juggling act. They would also argue that if they succeed in growing the economy, and they're thinking that by supporting people to spend money, that the people will spend the money and the economy will grow. It's a much more pro-growth manifesto than previous ones have been. That will also bring in more money. But it's a juggling act, and always has been, and always will be, until we have full control over the economy in Scotland.
Thank you. And Hugh, with Plaid Cymru, how can it appeal to voters who are concerned about the cost of living crisis or economic uncertainty, as opposed to Reform or other parties such as Labour, the Liberal Democrats, or the Conservatives even?
Yeah, well, basically they have 5 key priorities, and 3 of those got a link to the economy. So, supporting families with the cost of living, so providing free universal childcare for children from the age of 9 months, which will allow people to work and hopefully contribute to the economy, growing the Welsh economy and creating jobs. So they're looking at a green economic stimulus aimed at creating high quality green jobs and supporting businesses across Wales and investing in Welsh businesses. There's been a focus from the previous Labour government on inward investment over supporting sort of Welsh companies and tackling child poverty. So, the Welsh child payments similar to the one that you have in Scotland, £10 weekly payment for children under 6 in low income households. So again, if we can raise people out of poverty, that's going to benefit Wales economically. So yeah, I think the fact that they've got an economic plan that's been worked on over a couple of years, is quite impressive. They've actually got a plan to try and fix things that the previous sort of Labour government failed to deliver on.
And so, Hugh, earlier you mentioned speaking to a cafe owner who found that raw materials were becoming more expensive. So, what are Plaid Cymru's plans to support these small, independent, locally owned businesses specifically?
Yeah, I think obviously looking at taxation from sort of rates, trying to come up with a system that's fairer, that helps smaller companies rather than the current approach. But there's no denying, it is going to be hard because lots of the things that do impact sort of small businesses do tend to come from a UK perspective. But how can Plaid Cymru help sort of enliven high streets and get people to return into town centres to shop and try and get people off the reliance on Amazon and online shopping. So I think we need to have a culture shift more than anything. It's just getting people, like the cafe I was in yesterday, independent cafe. People travel from quite a distance to there because they are independent and you're supporting a local business who make their own food, as opposed to a Starbucks who all the stuff is made centrally somewhere and sent out on a daily basis. So I think it's a culture change, it's a change of mindset, and see how we can encourage people to support Welsh businesses as well as obviously investing in those Welsh businesses.
Thank you very much. Well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests William Duguid and Hugh Marshall. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.